This event is co-hosted by the Contemporary Philosophy of Technology Research Group and the Department of Politics and International Studies. Ross has written extensively on contemporary critical theory and its application to technology, and Professor Fuller, who's in discussion with Ross about his book after Ross has done a brief introduction, has written prolifically on the sociology and philosophy of science and technology, including the future of humanity. The format is that Ross will speak for about 20 minutes to introduce the book and the general themes from the book, and then Ross and Steve will be in discussion for about another 20-25 minutes, and then ideally would have at least 45 minutes for questions from the floor. And so without further ado, I will hand over to you, Ross.
Okay, well, I haven't got very long, so what I thought I'd do would be really just to open up some of the themes that emerge from Stiegler's work. The title of the book is The Philosophy of Bernard Stiegler, Capitalism, Technology and Politics and Spirit. So what I thought I'd do for the first 5 or 6 minutes is just to look at the three words that are part of the subtitle, which are capitalism, technology, and the politics of spirit. So I'll just say a little bit about that. In terms of exposition, I've kind of reversed the order. So I'll start with technology, and then move on to capitalism, and then briefly look at the politics of spirit. One of the primary themes that emerges from Stiegler's work is an attempt to rethink or to reconceptualize the idea of what technology is. And one of the main ideas that he presents is this notion of organology, or general organology, he sometimes calls it. And the concept of organology that he puts forward is the notion that human beings develop in relation to technology. And that if you want to understand the evolutionary tendency of human society, which he calls the technological tendency, you have to understand that each of these elements, technology and humanity, can only be understood in relation to each other. So the notion of organology is the idea that in order to understand humanity, you have to understand it in relation to the technological systems and programs through which it has evolved. And if you want to understand technology, you have to understand it in relation to the way it has affected the evolution of human beings. Now, in a sense, that can be seen as a kind of trivial assertion that these two things evolve together. But the interesting thing about it, as I'll hope to try and show slightly later on, is the idea that if these two things are seen organologically, it offers the possibility for treating technology not as something which is a kind of juggernaut that drags us along in a kind of evolutionary arc that we are largely unable to control, but actually opens up questions about the place of human beings within technological systems and the influence that their reflection, that their expressive capacities, their aesthetic capacities, etc., can have on the development of those systems. The other word in the subtitle is capital. And one of the things I've tried to do in the book is to reconceptualize the idea of the MCM relation, that is the commodity form, by calling it capitalization. And the reason I've done that is because I think it emphasizes the relationship that Stiegler tries to develop between the process of capitalization and technological evolution. And what he does is to try and show that the money-commodity-money relationship that Marx talks about has a kind of infinite flexibility about it. The way in which commodities are produced and what commodities actually are is something that is infinitely mutable in relation to the technological programs that produce them. And so one of the great things that he that he discusses in his book, or in Technics and Time, is the idea that one of the commodities that is particularly important in late modern societies is our attention, is the way in which we think, is our cognition, is the way in which we participate, the way in which we perform as individuals in consumer societies, which constantly present new commodities to us through visual and virtual media. So we have two of the essential themes here. We have technology and its organological relationship to human beings. We have the relationship between capital or capitalization, the MCM relationship, and the commodity form. And then the last one is probably the most important, which is the idea of a politics of spirit. Now, spirit has a very specific meaning, which I'll talk a little bit about in a second, in Stiegler's work. But to provide a kind of very provisional account of what he understands by spirit, he says in one of his what is effectively his autobiographical essay, Acting Out, "I must say that I remain a materialist in the sense of a materialism that does not deny spirit, but which poses that spirit, while not reducible to matter, is always conditioned by it." Now, what he means by that, I think, is that in this organological relationship between technology and human beings, what we are, as human beings, are embodied, somatic, and reflexive entities who have developed through technological programs. But that relationship is problematic in the sense that for Stiegler, the way in which we relate to these systems is something that is always jarring us out of the consistencies and symbolic relationships which constitute our social lives. And in that sense, the fact that we belong to this economy, whose organisation is something which always impinges upon us and transforms our experience of the world, and provides a sort of almost a traumatic relationship, a traumatic environment for us, it is this which provokes a certain politics of spirit, a reaction, a reflexive and somatic reaction within us which cannot be reduced directly to the way in which we perform in technological and programmatic systems. And it's that which he's trying to promote, an active channeling and expression and a politics of spirit that he sees as being essential for a mode of social life which is meaningful and happy. Okay, so they are the main kind of themes that that I've tried to discuss in the book and which crop up in the title and the subtitle. What I want to do is to briefly, I can't remember what time did we start?
You've got about 10 minutes.
About 10 minutes. What I want to do is to briefly draw attention to some of the main concepts that Stiegler deploys. These aren't mine, these are his, but I think it's worth talking about them given that he's the kind of, he's the subject matter of the book. The first one is originary technicity. This is the idea that human beings evolve in relation to technology, that the hominid species from which we develop their development is conditioned by tool use, and that this tool use is what forms them as a distinct kind of species. So that the somatic and physiological transformations that come about through tool use and give the species an evolutionary advantage also affect the way in which those species cooperate, influence their intentional development, their development of language, and the development of societies. So originary technicity is the idea that it is impossible to understand the transition from animal species to human species to society without imagining that technology is there from the very beginning. There's a notion that's related to that, which is the idea that technology, and the way it figures in human evolution, is what he calls a pharmacon. There's a complex discussion of the pharmacon that he has in the first volume of Technics and Time, where he relates it to Platonic philosophy. But the essence of what he's saying in terms of the idea of the pharmacon is that technology is ambivalent, that it does provide, or that it does produced environments in which the integrity, the spontaneity, the expressive capacities of human beings are put under threat by systems which are largely self-determining and come to control the subjectivity of individuals. However, on the other hand, the human species has become what it is through a process of what he calls technological elevation. Without technology, we don't become what we are. And for him, this is the essence of the project of modernity. It's this idea that we get the good and the bad simultaneously. They happen at the same time. And this goes back to this notion of the pharmacon, a pharmacological analysis, which tries to preserve a notion of spirit, which tries to preserve an idea that technology can support practices of spirit, which reinforce the symbolic relations of human society, but at the same time, new technologies which hardwire us into particular systems that make us elements of a performative industrial capitalism also provide a threat to the concept of society. Symbolic misery and happiness. Stiegler's later work has been a consideration of the nature of human life within hyper-industrial societies, within the systems which control our cognition, our somatic states, and which also have come to control the biological reproduction of the species. There's an idea in Stiegler's work that it is impossible to have an entirely prosthetic society which is held together by technological imperatives and technological codes. And in that sense, he questions the idea of a society which is a kind of prosthetically reproduced entity, and tries to reimagine symbolic relationships that could possibly take place through these new kinds of mediatic systems. He also, one of the major contributions of his later work on politics and economics is the idea of an economy of contribution. His suggestion is that if we reject a kind of transhumanist philosophy, it requires us to think about the symbolic objects to which we orientate our actions in society. So we might want to think about how we might reconstitute the idea of a republic as an ideal object which demands certain acts of sacrifice, self-control, certain acts of devotion, certain acts of reconciliation with others within it. And this is an object which for him has to be reconfigured within the technological environment of modern industrial societies. So if we recognize that it is impossible to have a happy existence which is based entirely upon technological and technocratic criteria, then this involves a kind of rethinking of classical notions of republic, of polis, and ideas of belonging and social happiness. How long have I got?
5 minutes.
5 minutes, okay. This is a bit rushed, I'm sorry about this, but I'd just open up some of the kind of issues, the substantive issues that I've tried to treat in the book itself. The first is the relationship between capitalism and technoscience, what Stiegler calls technoscience. Stiegler's work is indebted to the Frankfurt School in the sense that he regards one of the possibilities, one of the potentialities of technological system is the transformation of human beings into fungible units of energy which participate in a technocratic economy. And he wants to say that in late industrial societies, there's the threat that what can happen to us is that our libidinal energy becomes exhausted. And what he means by that is we get hardwired into a system of consumption which constantly re-engages us with new things that we want to buy and consume. Now, his particular reading of Freud in the concept of libido presents an idea that one of the things that makes us happy is the satisfactions that we get from investing in symbolic objects which don't exhaust our capacity for libidinal attachment, but actually re-provoke them. And this, for him, is the classical idea, the classical understanding of the polis as an ideal object, which doesn't simply ask things of us, but gives us back a sense of civic belonging and a sense of community, which makes us happy. One of the other chapters in the book that I talk about is the idea of biotechnologies and the capitalization of life. One of the interesting developments that he presents from the Frankfurt School is the notion that we aren't simply bewitched by the images of film stars like John Wayne or Clark Gable or whoever it is. We are actually physically able to transform our existence now through prosthetic techniques. And this leads to something which I've called the bad infinity of prosthetic beings. The notion that it's actually now to get it possible to become addicted to physiological transformations of what you are, which have been made possible by new prosthetic technologies. And also the idea that the horizon of these kind of interventions is the possibility of immortality. One of the other things that I've looked at is the notion of transhumanism. And again, I think it's fairly clear from this idea of an organological account of technology why Stiegler rejects this notion of a transhuman future for human beings. Because for him, and this comes back to an issue that I think is important, an important one that comes out of Stiegler's work, is the possibility of a kind of conservatism, a kind of philosophical conservatism that runs through his work, which is based around the concept of taking care of culture. Culture is a symbolic totality that looks after us because it's a collective expression of belonging, fellow feeling, and community. And so from that perspective, he's an advocate of certain ideas like things like slow science, like a restricted concept of development, because for him, simply turning over social development to technological forces is something which will always lead to this kind of sense of disorientation, which is the central concept of Volume 2 of Techniques in Time. The last chapter of the book really is concerned with a certain idea of cosmopolitanism, which is articulated around the university and also around the idea of a certain concept of environmentalism that grows out of this idea of technology and of taking care. The idea of a radical kind of cosmopolitanism that's based around the preservation of species life and the kind of failure of the Western paradigm of consumerist capitalism. All right, so I'm sorry it's been quite so rushed, but I'm just trying to provide some kind of overview of what the book's about and some of the main concepts and ideas that hopefully Professor Fuller will respond to.
Thanks, Ross.
No one's clapping? But you don't have to clap for me afterwards. First of all, I want to thank Justin, I guess, for inviting me to be the commentator on this. As far as I understand, this is the first book in English to actually have a comprehensive coverage of Stiegler's work. Is that correct?
I don't know, but I hope so.
I would have thought that's why you got the contract, actually. I mean, no, it's quite an achievement. So in terms of people who are just, because my own acquaintance with Stiegler is very much in bits and pieces, primarily having to do with the philosophy of technology, and especially through the media side of things. But this is the first time that I've actually seen Stiegler's work presented in a very sort of comprehensive and coherent fashion. So I recommend the book. I think there's always first of all, I think Ross also did a really good job in terms of outlining the general sorts of issues that Stiegler's work raises. And I hope we get a chance to discuss those. But one thing I do want to start, you might say, on a methodological point. This has to do with the fact that if you actually read Ross's book, as opposed to Ross's own very lucid presentation, that in a sense, all of these topics that he has floated by you, which are very much part of Stiegler's corpus, Stiegler has very particular ways of getting into them. So in fact, unless you've read, let's say, Derrida, or you've read the Frankfurt School, or you've read Gilbert Simondon, or people like that. If you haven't read those guys, it's actually quite hard to get into what Stiegler's talking about, even though what Stiegler's talking about is really quite salient to the kind of world we live in now. And so in this respect, Stiegler is very much a philosopher of now. Okay? So that's kind of one issue, in a way I want to flag, namely that if we want to talk about the sorts of issues that Stiegler's in fact flagging, and has kind of a lot of resonance, I think, for the sort of French intellectual market where he's primarily addressing, would we want to be talking about things in quite the same way he talks about them in order to make the same points? Okay? So I want to put that on the table, in a friendly gesture to kind of, in a way, open up the issues that he's in fact raising. Because obviously issues having to do with the future of capitalism and how the acceleration in technological development interacts with it, and the sort of sense of what it means to be a human being that comes from it. All of these issues are very much part of where we are now. And the question, though, then becomes just how helpful Stiegler, the detail of Stiegler is with regard to these kinds of issues. Okay? So in my mind, the jury's out. Okay? So in other words, it's not so obvious to me. And I think this is one of the things that we always have to keep in mind, and it's a general feeling I have about a lot of contemporary French thought. And I'm someone who, as an undergraduate, so 40 years ago, I was part of this wave when all these translations of Derrida and Foucault and so forth were first coming out into English, and they really did sort of kind of crystallize the way I think about things. So I'm actually quite prima facie sympathetic to this general line of thinking. But I do think that sometimes there is a tendency to be over precious about the detail of the particular thinker, rather than actually extracting kind of the salient point and maybe re-embedding it in some other context where it can actually be discussed more openly and with a certain degree of latitude. So you don't need to know what Plato's Pharmakon is about, for example, right? Which is a kind of Derrida thing, right? That Stiegler picks up from, because part of Stiegler's intellectual authority, you might say, derives from Derrida, right? So those of you who are familiar with French thought, this is often how people end up getting into Stiegler in the first place. But if you're not part of that scene, nevertheless, these things are very important, okay? And they go very much to the kind of issues of what, philosophy is about, and especially what it means to be a human being. And this is something that Stiegler puts very much on the table. I agree with Ross that I see Stiegler as kind of a conservative, basically. A kind, in a way, those of you who know something about the evolution of the Frankfurt School, for example, especially once we start moving into the post-war era, and the kinds of political stances that those guys took. So even though at one level they're still talking the same talk of being critical and disruptive and everything, but what that boils down to as far as actual politics, right, turns out to very often align to relatively conservative views. And so this idea of taking care of culture, for example. Now that's a very high humanist idea. Now, of course, what it means to take care of culture in 2016 is quite different from what it meant after World War I, when this idea became popular in the first place, right? And there are different kinds of people, and there's a different style of doing it. But nevertheless, what they do have in common, and this is where I think Stiegler is making some interesting moves with regard to technology, is that, historically when we talk about taking care of culture, there usually is sort of in the background some idea of a human essence, right? Understood in a fairly strong sense of the term, right? And this is the kind of thing that would anchor intuitions and judgments that, let's say, Plato is talking about something that's relevant to us today because we're just as human as Plato was, and the problem of justice, the problem of the good, the problem of the true, all these issues, they're basically the same issue. People are just articulating them in their own different cultural contexts, and those things are very important to remember because ultimately they're all referring back to the same issues that we're all concerned about, because there's a human essence. Now, if you look at what has been the historical grounding for human essence, it's varied, but of course there is the animal species idea, which in a sense Darwin blew open, so that one doesn't apply. And of course, there is, the Abrahamic notion that there is a kind of distinct, unique character to the human being that in a way transcends animal nature and puts it much closer to God. And in fact, what we normally call classical humanism with that kind of notion of the human is very much indebted to that sort of view. And it's basically a kind of democratized, secularized version of that view. But what that view lacked, which Stiegler picks up on, and I think is very relevant to the way we reconceptualize the human today, is the technology side, right? Because if you look at high humanism, when there was this idea of protecting the human, really the only technology of interest to those people was writing, right? And in fact, this would even be a basis for grading cultures and and all that kind of stuff. And those of you who still feel a certain kind of resentment to humanism, right? That's usually what you have in mind, right? But if you think of writing as just one among many technologies, and what they're doing is reconfiguring the life world and reconfiguring the human, right? Then you start to get into a kind of a different sort of notion of the human, a kind of more open-ended notion of the human, where whatever it means to be human is not historically closed, right? And of course, Hegel, all these people already kind of had this idea. It's not like this idea has been invented last week. And in fact, the issue, though, has been to try to get this kind of sensibility into the front line of philosophical thinking about the human. In other words, taking just as seriously the idea that, being in front of a computer is as much a kind of human experience as it is to write a long tract. This is still kind of a struggle, right? And this is one of the reasons why philosophy of technology remains a relatively outlier subject within proper philosophy. Whether we're talking about metaphysics or epistemology or any of those subjects, it's seen a kind of a specialty subject rather than as core to what those fields are about. Okay, and so Stiegler can be seen as someone who, in a sense, is trying to redress that kind of balance. Now, what is not entirely clear in Stiegler's writing, and it's not to blame him in particular, but it's a kind of an open issue about how is it exactly so it's one thing to say at a very general level that that the human is configured in some way by the tools that the human creates. And there's a kind of a feedback mechanism in some sense, right? But there's lots of ways of thinking about that, actually, right? So for example, if you recall somebody like Marshall McLuhan, he was very much of the opinion, which was very dominant, you might say, in the early history of the philosophy of technology from the late 19th century, when is that it's an extension of the senses, right? An extension of the senses, right? And this is a phrase that comes from Ralph Waldo Emerson, actually, and he was talking about the telegraph, okay? And that's where this idea comes from. And and obviously you can see, now you have this kind of image, and it's an image not too distant from the way, that in a sense we potentially have access and we can communicate with anyone, anywhere. In a sense, we're much larger in some sense, or more comprehensive than just our physical bodies from which we came, right? And this was actually very much part of what Emerson was about, and the transcendental movement and this kind of life affirmation. This was expanding the human, and, in a very important way, perhaps, taking over the world in some kind of sense. That was always very much there, and that is kind of the original sense of it. But of course, if you keep that idea intact, right, one of the things, and this is where McLuhan is kind of presenting a sort of ironic twist on Emerson, is Emerson believed that in some sense the human is always in control, right? So it's an extension of a kind of free agent. It's giving more scope for the free agent to act as a free agent, okay? But of course, with McLuhan, you start to get this much more what we would normally call materialist slant on this, where in a sense the medium actually does end up conditioning in a very serious way and shaping and restricting and so forth what these expressions of freedom are going to turn out to be. Okay, and of course if you start putting capitalism into this, you start getting the Frankfurt School, right? And that's one kind of trajectory that one could think about, and I think that Stiegler, in a way, is participating in that to a certain extent. But then there's this other kind of idea of what happens is that the technology actually becomes a kind of created other which interacts in a kind of equal way. Okay, so I don't know how much, what other kinds of works you people read when you think about technology, but if you think about there is this phrase that was originally introduced by Alfred Kroeber in the early 20th century, the anthropologist Alfred Kroeber. I don't know if any of you know who he is. He's the father of Ursula Le Guin, the science fiction novelist, okay? He introduced this idea of the super organism. And the super organism is basically the technological life world in which human beings, in a sense, incubate and become more human. So what he's imagining is not an extension of the senses, but a kind of smart environment, right, which in a sense accelerates our evolution, essentially. And in fact, this is what he would argue makes it easier for each generation to progress more quickly, because there are more of these artifacts and things that, in a sense, are continually training us up. And he has a relatively positive view of this, okay? And if you look at somebody like Richard Dawkins, when he talks about the extended phenotype is kind of that idea applied across species. And that's a kind of and for a lot of people who are involved in sociobiology or evolutionary psychology, those kinds of fields that try to bridge the social and the biological, that's often their definition of culture. Right? That's what culture means to them. Culture is this kind of life world, this artificial life world, which then serves as a kind of incubator for new, for progressive kind of beings. Okay? So there's that. And then there is this other aspect, which, again, one wonders to what extent Stiegler engages with this, but it's the one that, in a sense, the transhumanists flirt with or promote even, and it's the idea that we merge with the technology. Right? So in some sense, and this is where it becomes interesting, what does the human mean under these circumstances? Because in the first view that I mentioned with regard to McLuhan and Emerson and people like that, right, the technology is an extension of the self, and that's pretty understandable. And then the second one, right, the technology is a kind of an incubator, a kind of smart environment, right, but still, there is still the human being in there, developing perhaps more quickly than it would otherwise, whatever. But now with this other view that I'm talking about, there is a kind of merging of the human and the technological. When we talk about cyborgs, for example, right? Cyborgs would be the most obvious example. And when we start, and when I talk about cyborgs, I don't know what you imagine, but let's imagine Stephen Hawking. There you go, cyborg number one, okay? Because there what we have here, right, is someone who, we still think of as a human being, okay? But for all intents and purposes, this guy is just pure prosthetics. Right? The prosthetics are really enabling this guy in a really very substantial sense. Okay? Now you might say, well, this is enabling Stephen Hawking to be a kind of full human being or something like this. But that, it seems to me, is operating under a kind of assumption that in a way the introduction of this kind of technology is eroding. And that's the idea that in some sense, all of these very sophisticated, highly developed prosthetics have to be used to redress disabilities where we have some kind of constant notion of what it means to act as a normal human. Right? And so then we license all kinds of prosthetics, a la Stephen Hawking, totally prosthetic up, right? But on the assumption that it's restoring a kind of human function where the notion of what the normal human function is pretty stable. And so as a result, when I tell you that, Stephen Hawking is a cyborg, you might laugh. Right? You might laugh. You might say, it's a joke. This is funny. Okay? Now, here's the problem. The problem is that the more that we see these kinds of prosthetics in operation, right, they cease to actually appear as remedying disabilities. In other words, you start to get people, and I have been, as someone who hangs around a lot with transhumanists and may even be one himself, I am in many situations where you have a lot of people who would be happy to cut off limbs, to put more technologically advanced things into them. And, and the whole idea of people willing to upload themselves into machines, even if it means that their physical body dies, right? They just and then they're able to mingle with all the other virtual selves that are out there forever. There are a lot of people who find this a very attractive option given the world we live in today. Okay? And this is no longer being seen, as somehow necessarily strange, but as something, as a way of expressing humanity. Right? This is the point that I want to raise here. That in a sense, the kinds of notion of what is human and what is not human that previously anchored even the most advanced, technological development of prosthetics and so forth, this is disappearing. Okay? And that people, and the way I would look at it, okay, and this is where it might become an interesting thing to think about it, is that this is part of the spiritualization of people. Right? That people are increasingly increasingly capable of imagining their humanity being expressed in more and more different forms of embodiment. Right? Different forms of resurrection, if you will, in some cases. Okay? This is actually very much on the table. And so in this respect, you might say, the advances in the development of prosthetics, in the various technologies that are used to enhance people, that transhumanists are always celebrating, whether it's biotechnology, nanotechnology, information technology, whatever those things are, right? So there's all this kind of, as it were, materialism out there in the development of science and technology to enhance the human, but they're also giving people more opportunity, so it is presented, of defining what it means to be human, and how one is human, and where one is human. Okay? And so the issue then, to me at least it seems, and by the way, what I'm talking about here is what transhumanists call morphological freedom. Morphological freedom. And morphological freedom, in the recent presidential campaign, which we could be discussing as well, that there was a third-party candidate on the transhumanist party, Zoltan Istvan. I don't know if any of you heard of this guy. He went to the United States Capitol at the end of last year and posted transhumanist Bill of Rights, right? In a very Martin Luther style, sort of nailed it on there. And if you look at what these transhumanist Bill of Rights, what do people, American citizens, have the right to? Morphological freedom. Not just freedom of expression as normally understood, not even just freedom to bear arms or something, but morphological freedom. The freedom to be whatever kind of being one wants as a human being. Okay? This is a very radical idea of the human, and I would submit to you that it's, in a very strange kind of way, it's a spiritualized attitude, right? Because when people start getting very kind of antsy about what the spirit mean, the operational definition that I think usually silences people is that the spirit can be multiply embodied. Right? So in other words, because if the spirit only has one way it can be materially, then there's arguably not spirit at all. It's just this thing, and that's just the organization of the thing that you're calling the spirit, right? That would be Aristotle's view, for example. But if you're talking about something that can be the same human, but nevertheless exist in virtual reality, exist with prosthetics, without prosthetics, and you could flip between them, morphological freedom, some way, this is very spiritualized. Okay? I mean, there are a lot of political economic questions that arise with this, like who's actually going to be in a position to exercise this right if people actually had the right to it, right? That obviously is the political question. And with transhumanism, you may know that, of course, Silicon Valley billionaires and, these kinds of people, they're on top of this big time. And with Donald Trump as president, the doors are open. Now, I'm serious. That's another matter we can discuss here. But the point is that this, from the standpoint of philosophically, how do we want to characterize what's going on here? Okay, it seems to me that perhaps for the kind of world that we're moving into now, where transhumanism is gaining gradually a certain amount of popular respectability and certainly investment and so forth, that one should no longer take for granted, in a way I think Stiegler still does, that there is some really clear notion of what the human is that needs to be preserved in some way. It seems to me that there's a lot more that's negotiable among people with regard to what the human is, right, in going forward, than I think his philosophy allows for. I think in this respect, I think he's still too much wedded in a kind of, 20th century Frankfurt School kind of high capitalism mentality. And that's why I think, while I think that Stiegler is actually pointing to a lot of very important questions that are very much on the table for us now, I think that perhaps his general mode of approach may be a little bit behind the time, actually, in terms of how we think about reconstituting the human as some kind of normative category, which I take it to be ultimately what his project's about. It's about reconstituting the human as a normative category. And with that, I'll stop. Is that okay?
I was going to say 5 minutes if you want. But
No, it's okay. I'll stop here. Is that all right?
yeah.
Okay, thank you.
So the floor is now open for questions. Or do you want to respond to some of those points before we?
Well, we got a questioner already there.
There's a question.
Thank you. So I really enjoyed. I really must read your book. It sounds wonderful, and I've never read Stiegler's work. But I was really interested, for both of you, in this question of the human. In coming at it from a sort of queer theory perspective.
Sure. Yeah.
Judith Butler's work, for
Yeah.
example, would obviously be on the human, and about how the human is made intelligible through gender. So, that moment when a child is born, the naming, is it a boy, is it a girl, is how the human comes into being. From the child becomes from an it to a he or a she, and therefore becomes human. And I was wondering if that's something that is reflected upon, if that's of interest with respect to an issue that you've been exploring, and also how that might relate to the question of technology as well, and with both of you really.
Yeah, I have something to say, but you want to start off? I do have something to say to this question, but since you're the Stiegler man here, give us what's the line on this?
Well, actually, he says remarkably little, almost nothing.
Okay.
But obviously,
See, I told you the guy's behind the times.
yeah. I mean, obviously, the whole idea of prosthesis is something which opens up the question of, kind of biological ascription of gender characteristics.
Yes.
And there is certainly room to write some stuff on, as Joanna has done, on what the significance of this originary technicity thesis would have for kind of gender studies. But he says nothing.
Right.
Let me, because I think there's an interesting kind of angle on this. I mean, first of all, people who are of the LGBT community tend to be quite on the same wavelength with transhumanists. I think that's one point. But there's one person I want to mention specifically, which will be interesting from the standpoint of the capitalist critique side of things, and that's Martine Rothblatt. Do you know who this person is?
No.
Okay, so Martine Rothblatt began life as a man, and was a media lawyer, made a lot of money and so forth, and then had a gender change, and went on and flourished and so forth, and became one of the sort of promoters of the idea of cyber cells and things like this. The idea that in fact there should be some, because like I say, she's a lawyer, so that there should be some kind of legal arrangement whereby one could, as it were, give birth to virtual selves, and they can have rights of their own after a while, like after a certain period of maturation takes place. And she's been actually writing a lot about that kind of stuff. But the interesting thing about her from the capitalist standpoint is that she ends up being the wealthiest female CEO in the United States. Okay, right? I mean, beating all of the biologically originating women. Okay, and this is a real sore point, I would say, with regard to the gender politics of transhumanism, because I do think there is concern among certain feminists who are very much concerned that women's rights do not get sort of submerged in this kind of indefinite plurality of embodiments and things like this, right? That in fact that it's going to end up being a kind of colonization of men by stealth, right? Because that and so there is an interest, so there's a kind of new level, you might say, where the gender politics will play themselves out with transhumanism, and it will involve capitalism, because in a sense the men who become women end up bringing with them, right, the capital. They bring it's not like they bring what they had as men, only now they're as women, and it becomes a more competitive space being a woman there. You see, and that I think is the tricky political issue that all of this raises. So you're seeing a lot of friction on this matter. Yeah. Okay.
I can separate all this, but was there someone else who wanted to? Thank you so much. Just just to say as well, I thought it was interesting you talking about technologies and also, but then related to embodiment. And I was actually thinking about fan fiction. Have you come across fan fiction?
Fan fiction, sure.
How technology there, but how, for example, gendered identities, all sorts of different identities, including sort of transhuman identities, are being sort of expressed and explored and articulated and produced in an apparently disembodied, I mean, it's obviously not disembodied in the sense that people are on computer screens, but that all of these different subjectivities are emerging, and including political subjectivities as well, in this space fan fiction, obviously in ways that are still race and class and all of these hierarchies still at play, even though it's a disembodied space, but that it's a really interesting new form of technology in a way where it's not just embodiment is playing out, but actual disembodied subjectivities.
Well, see, this is where I would see what she's describing. I would say is enriching humanity, but maybe Stiegler or you would disagree with that.
Can I? Okay. I just want to say something which perhaps will set up a debate, about and to respond a little bit to what you said about the transhumanist trajectory of things. I think it is certainly possible to see the kind of de facto trajectory of what he calls hyper-industrial societies towards a kind of transhumanist existence. And I entirely take your point that that these things are emerging in things like the redefinition of human rights, transgendered identities, all of that kind of stuff, and I entirely take your point there. However, by way of a kind of Stieglerian response, to take a very old formation of the question concerning technology from Heidegger, the question I think I'd like to put to you would be this: is the idea of the human as something which is essentially embodied, as something whose spiritual practice in constituting symbolic relationships which it finds satisfying and formative of particular communities in which its identity achieves some kind of collective being. Firstly, is that something which is dispensable?
No, it just might be multiple. That's the thing, right? Because the way you put it, you make it sound like that there's only one form of embodiment for the human.
No, I don't think. What I'm trying to suggest is that perhaps this kind of breaking out into multiple identities is perhaps more problematic for a kind of species that has evolved through these kind of cathectic relationships, and the way he describes that through kind of Freudian ideas about what it is to belong to a community. But the other thing is, I think that something is evolving now in late capitalist societies where there is a very close relationship between neoliberalism and kind of transhumanist horizon, which is evolving around things. It's something I try to argue in the chapter on biopolitical capital, around cosmesis. So you can change, you can be what you want, around the pursuit of an idea of immortality, which is something which is now part of the kind of horizon of medical practice. So there's a kind, as you said, it's bound up. The evolution of technology is bound up with certain specific interests, which are being shaped by a radical form of individualism. And what plays around that is the idea of a continuation of a kind of material existence that for many people is radically impoverished. And so, this kind of idea of a technological trajectory that is dragging everybody along with it. I find I find quite problematic. All right. And it's something he hits on.
No, but so there is a real. This is true. I mean, so if you follow the whole transhumanist kind of discourse, one of the things that's assumed by it is that basically the reason why not everyone's on board with transhumanism is because they don't realize just how probable it is, right? So there's a lot of people who are still dismissing it as science fictional and so forth. But if people were to really find out that it is possible to live forever if we just switch a couple of genes or something, right, that they'll all be on board with it. And so what transhumanism never talks about, except under the guise of ignorance, is people who don't want it, even after they know about it. Okay, so right. So this is a real serious political blind spot, you might say, of the movement, which is part of what gives it its own kind of sense of forward momentum, right? Namely, the only reason why people wouldn't want this is because they don't take it sufficiently seriously. But once they realize it's possible, everybody will want this. So there isn't really much of a politics of people who rationally refuse. In fact, it's not clear that refusers would be recognized as rational, which is very problematic from the standpoint of issues concerning humanity. So you're absolutely right. There is really that issue, and the reason why this issue isn't more prominent is because transhumanism isn't more plausible yet, right? But the point is, as the momentum builds, I think this issue you're raising is going to become a much more politically salient issue. You know, if you've got everybody kind of, switching their gene, if you've got not everyone, but let's say 10 or 20% of the population, when given the option to live forever, decides to do so, what happens? How does that relate to the rest of the people in the society?
Another provocation, would you say that someone who has prosthetically had their existence enhanced to the point where many of the limitations that an organic body places upon you, if that's gone, what kind of subject does that produce? Isn't that a kind of neoliberalist nightmare when you've got somebody who is just the ultimate consumer of everything?
Well, I don't know if it means you're a consumer, but what it does mean is that I think what really gets threatened here, and this is where I think this kind of move could undermine, because if you think about neoliberalism as in part also involving not just a kind of extension of capitalism into politics, but also an increase in auditing and accountability, right? That's a very important part of what the neoliberal sensibility is. That very much does depend on embodied selves being pretty well localizable, right? You got to know where people, it's like the Foucault thing, right? You got to be able to nail them down, right? So then you can regulate them in some way. But if you allow for morphological freedom, and people are kind of maneuvering in and out of modes of being, then the kind of regulatory framework that something like neoliberalism presupposes gets very severely challenged. You get something that's much closer to anarchy, actually, than neoliberalism, right? I mean, because this is the issue. I mean, and I think this is where, if you want to talk about where the social bonds start to break down, right? Because these kinds of social bonds of mutuality do have ideas of rights and responsibilities are reciprocal to each other. You can put, I'm putting it very legalistically, but of course there are more kind of intuitive ways of talking about this. But those things presuppose that there's a clear boundary between you and me and that we relate in a specific way and all the rest of it. But if you're able to change form whenever you feel like it, or at least if some people are allowed to do that, then it seems to me that really does tear apart that sense of having a social fabric, in whatever space it takes place, whether it be in virtual reality or in physical reality.
Do you think that Stiegler's work is the last stand of something which is entirely contingent, which is the kind of material or embodied being, and that all this stuff about taking care of culture and symbolic relationships will in the end turn out to be something that is just an impediment to a technological trajectory that will take us all with it? Or, as he would say, this is the ultimate expression of the question concerning technology, which is always about our relationship to it, and sometimes saying, no, we don't fucking want that.
No, I agree. No, I think you're right on the latter point. I mean, my only issue with Stiegler, because Stiegler's raising a perfectly valid point, and I think we've illuminated why this is a valid point. It's just whether the philosophical resources that he draws on are adequate to really getting you beyond a certain point. That's the point I would say, right? So in other words, it's like you can get to a certain point, thinking about what Derrida means and Simondon and all these people, and they get you certain distance. But these guys are themselves very much captive by the kind of technological life worlds that they themselves inhabit. And as we move into new ones, the intellectual resources they provide may not be sufficient. And I think this is in a way, this is why I began my remarks by saying, whether Stiegler's way of getting into the topic, in a way marks him as a person of a certain period in intellectual history, right? Even if the topic is, as I agree with you, is a kind of perennial topic in a sense.
Yeah.
It's not clear that his way of getting into it is going to give you the best way to kind of continue thinking about it in a critical fashion. I mean, that would be my final verdict on him. But it's not that what he's raising is invalid. Not at all. One can, if one understands how he gets into topics, one can see exactly what he's talking about.
Yeah. Does anybody else want to join?
Yeah.
I wonder, though, if this notion of the transhuman, that actually Simondon actually gives us the trans individual.
Yes.
Which I find almost more interesting as a way to explain where we are now than probably it was for Simondon in 1962, because then we give the trans back to the technology as well. It's not just
right at the site. Well, yeah, because
if you could talk.
Well, I mean,
you get individuation, which doesn't necessarily have to include the human, that we seem to find so problematic.
Well, my own. I mean, you might have something to say about this, but my own view about Simondon on this is what makes him very illuminating now.
Yeah.
In a way, I actually, if I had to make a choice, I would say he's actually a more illuminating thinker than Stiegler is on issues we're talking about now, because Simondon's coming into this through cybernetics, and when you start to take the cybernetic worldview seriously, so cybernetics is you've heard of cybernetics. It's this idea of basically mathematics of self-regulating autonomous systems, where the idea being that humans, animals, and machines, in a sense, can be all understood in principle in the same way through these kinds of mathematical equations, basically, of self-regulating, self-governing systems. And so then the question becomes, okay, then what is going to be the unit of individuation of each of these kind of autonomous beings, regardless of what their material makeup is, right? So you can start talking about things like individuation in a relatively substrate neutral way, right? You don't have to focus on the human, right? You could be talking about machines or animals or whatever. You're talking about what makes any of them individuals. And I think that's actually a very useful conceptual starting point for the way in which the argument is posed these days.
Me too.
Yeah, and in that respect, because in a sense I think Stiegler comes into it too loaded with the human and a certain kind of old notion of the human, which he's trying to keep alive. And I think that in a way already kind of handicaps you a little bit in terms of thinking about what the prospects for the future are.
And also this originary idea of technology isn't there.
Right, that's right.
Muriel Kuhn's in her book, I think, makes a good argument where Stiegler falls down in that respect.
You want to say something to this? You're the Stiegler man.
My understanding of Simondon's work is, but I mean, I know the stuff about switching systems and how switching systems gradually become more and more intelligent, and the development of individuals is something that comes through a largely mechanistic process. I'm trying to recall exactly what Stiegler's position on it is. I think he calls it a mechanology, doesn't he? He says that there's an absence of individuation in it, and that in the end the system produces the individual as something which is just a direct reflection of itself. I think what I find attractive about Stiegler's interpretation of that is what the individual ends up being is an amalgamation of technology, bodily embodiment and reflection. And his notion of spirit is interesting because what he's suggesting is we start to think and reason and rationalize about things because of the sense of trauma that we have in relation to the technological relationships that we grow up in. And that's what makes the question concerning technology a kind of eternal question for him. Now, I think...
And Simondon would say it's anxiety.
Exactly,
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
Mm-hmm. And it's because, for him, sorry, I'm not talking
No,
for him here, but it's very much about the pre-individual.
Yes, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Which it's not technology that underpins this sort of dynamic, it's this pre-individual. And I
Exactly,
think individuation then talks to your question, I think, maybe possibly can engage with your question.
Yeah.
Sorry.
But I mean, so there's a question that's come up now, which comes out of the stuff on Simondon. So, if that sort of more not mechanistic, but that kind of directly technological account is true, how would you see recent developments contributing towards a transhumanism?
In a sense, this is where, again, one always has to readjust to where we are now. I mean, I think the aspect of the sort of cybernetic vision that Simondon had, which is relevant to now, is if you think about cybernetics as, yes, maybe in some original sense grounded in the understanding of computers, but nevertheless one that is designed to be kind of neutral, so that in some sense you could in principle be attributing whatever you want to call it, value or life or something, to a whole range of differently embodied things, but you're not privileging the human in the process. In a sense, you make the question of the human, not the question of the technology, but the question of the human, the open question. Right? In other words, what is it, if you've got all of these multiple ways of embodying self-governing, automated systems, etc., and we can understand them all kind of in principle the same way, what difference does the human make in this? I think that's more the question that we've got on the table today, and I think because, the kinds of answers that we're getting, the so-called new answers of what the human is, and you were kind of a bit alluding to it at the end of your remarks, with regard to the Anthropocene, okay? So the environmental issue, right? If you think about relatively recent attempts to define what is exceptional about the human in all of these different systems and things that are happening, it's negative, right? I mean, that's the thing. I mean, however, the Anthropocene is generally portrayed, right, as this period in geological time where humans make all the difference to the environment, right? They make the major difference in the sense of being traceable to be the source of the major environmental changes. You may call them catastrophic, you may say this is just part of the way the world works, but nevertheless it's a kind of causal claim about the significance of humans as opposed to everything else that's on the planet. That's what the Anthropocene is. And it's usually portrayed in a negative light, okay? And so people who make this kind of argument, who are so-called not transhuman, but post-human, right? Post-human thinkers, in some sense, what they want to do is they want to displace the value that is presupposed by the human. And this is where Stiegler starts to look a little old-fashioned. Because in some sense, he thinks somehow recovering the human endlessly through all our technological manifestations is going to somehow redeem us. But in fact, maybe the problem itself, which has been demonstrated, you might say, in a sense, technology shows the falsification of the human. Right? The extent to which the human is not what it's cracked up to be from a value standpoint. See, I think that's the way the post-human, if a post-humanist were in the room, which is different from a transhumanist, but a post-humanist, right? This is where Simondon looks very attractive because Simondon is indifferent with regard to the human.
I think that the question of the Anthropocene is an interesting one because recently there's been some consensus to emerge that says that an economy of sacrifice isn't going to be enough. That even if we cut down on emissions radically now, we are still reliant on the development of technologies that will actually take carbon out of the atmosphere, because without that, that's not going to be enough. So in a sense, that kind of poses a question about the kind of Stieglerian approach, which is one that says there has to be a species level taking care of not just culture, but of the environment, if you like, a relationship between culture and environment, which cuts down on emissions by saying that the kind of Western consumerist model of society hasn't worked, and that there has to be some kind of recognition of a species life, which involves radical sacrifice. And on the other, you've also got this idea that there has to be the development of new technologies which are able to accomplish something that we can't do at the moment. So it seems that what's happening with the Anthropocene is a coming together of these two things in kind of one catastrophic, if you like, situation.
Yeah, well, so that's not good. I mean, it seems to me that, you have this situation where some people would say you
taking care, or is it?
Well, if you look, if you're post-human, if you're a real post-humanist and of a dark green variety, you would say, look, you want to take care of the planet, cut down on the number of humans, for heaven's sakes. Forget about all this technological bullshit that you're talking about. Just get rid of humans. Right? We need, and this is why some of these people are quite happy to embrace a certain kind of catastrophism in the end of the day. Because the way you're going to get this kind of reconciliation with nature, right, is going to be, not just by sacrificing consumption in the sense you're talking about, but rather by sacrificing actual individual members of the species that have overpopulated the planet. Right? That is and this is, basically understanding our relationship with nature as being as co-equals, at least, right? In other words, it's not like because the way you're talking about it, it's kind of like we get a kind of reconciliation of nature that still enables us to be in some sense on top, right? And in fact, we're going to even add some smart technology to enable us to do it so we can reaffirm the kind of being we've been for the last 40,000 years, right? So we're going to have smarter technology, it'll enable us to stay on top. But maybe what we need to do is to have the kind of co-equal relationship, which would mean cut down on humans altogether.
But the first option you suggested is exactly what he'd want. It's exactly what he'd want because he isn't anti-technological. I mean, that's something that's very clear all the way through the book. He talks about we only become what we are through what he calls a technological elevation. So he's not retreating into a position where he's saying that this whole project is some kind of backward-looking taking care of culture. It is the basis of a reflective or speculative judgment about what our relationship to technology is and what kind of technologies we want to use. So that kind of question about the Anthropocene, about which technologies should we choose to develop, well, he would say, yes, you have to put money into looking for stuff that is actually going to protect the planet and what we have at the moment.
But why not just radically scale back the human condition? I mean, some of you may have seen this movie from a couple of years ago, Transcendence, starring Johnny Depp, right? I don't know if any of you have seen this movie. It's an interesting movie in a way. The thing about the movie, basically, the punchline, which is relevant here, is that, so here we've got this guy who's trying to upload his consciousness and all this, and he ends up plugging himself into all the networks of the world. We'll just be able to do it faster now because our technology is accelerating. The other side says, no, it's going to be self-destruction. Both of them want acceleration, because the second one says the self-destruction will be a lesson to us. It'll be it'll be like nature taking us down, okay? And there are people who advocate this. Nick Land, you may know
I've met Nick Land.
Okay, Nick Land, formerly of Warwick University, now in Shanghai. Okay, this guy, this is the man I'm thinking about here, right? Who has this kind of view that, we will eventually self-destruct and we'll force human beings to no longer valorize their humanity so much, and this will mean the sort of decoupling from the human trajectory from the technological trajectory. I don't endorse this stuff, but this is on the table. Yeah.
Well, this is absolutely fascinating. Thank you. I just wondered if the mediating concept here is it not just democratization? I don't want to be sort of bland and old hat about it.
Hey, I have nothing against democratization.
But it's not my area, but I feel relatively relaxed about this dichotomy you've got between the acceleration and the step down.
Yeah.
I'm intrigued by the slow science idea, right? Because can't we just take democratic decisions about technologies going forward, population control, right? These are matters of political.
So where's the forum for these decisions to be taken?
Yeah. So I'm thinking here of Warwick Beck. Okay, because he grappled with this, didn't he? Right? Sure. And the problem, so he identifies the problem, the risks, but the pathos is that you've got institutions collapsing and a lack of faith in decisions at the very moment that we need crystal clear decision making and democratized decision making. But that doesn't mean giving up on working on institutions rather than betting the whole farm on the technologies. So we've not talked about institutional embeddedness.
Yes.
Of the technologies, really, and so my gut feeling is I'm with Stiegler because he's all for that, I guess.
Yeah. But this is where but the idea of reinventing durable institutions in the current technological climate, right? So is a tricky question, okay? So that even if you look at, let's say, Silicon Valley, okay, a lot of the people who are there are actually see themselves as actually progressive thinkers trying to help human beings and all the rest of it. They actually see themselves very much this way. But they think the solution to everything is an app. right? So in other words, they don't have a conception of institutions whatsoever. They really think these problems can be solved a lot easier than they really can. If we're talking about trying to renovate institutions that actually enable to keep on board the vast majority of the population that in previous institutions were kept on board, right? Because of course it's not hard, you know, for the vanguard to just take off, you know, but to actually carry on, you know, the bulk of, you know, so how do you reinvent social democracy, right? Social democracy in which you have a population which feels in some sense collectively responsible for the welfare of everybody, regardless of how much they're actually contributing to the economy. How do you reinvent that in the world that we're getting into now? Because unless you can reinvent that sensibility, right, then what you're talking about is not going to happen. And I think that's the thing that's in its death throes.
Yeah, but it seems to me that this kind of techno-futurist transhumanism is not going to help us invent that model of social democracy.
Well, there is something called techno-progressive.
Yeah.
Not every. No. I'm just saying, transhumanism is a many-sided feast, you might say, they're not all libertarians, okay? Most of them are, the noisiest ones are, the ones with the money are, okay, fair enough. But there are also so-called techno-progressive people, and so you get somebody a sociologist in the United States, James Hughes, who wrote this book, Cyborg Citizen. It came out now, 15 years ago at least, right? And who's very explicit by saying, how are we going to reinvent, as it were, the political platform of social democracy in this rapidly changing technological environment where the drivers are very much against social democracy. And he continues to put that very much on the front burner. But I'll tell you something, most of the people who are actually involved in transhumanism at best pay lip service to this, but nobody's working hard on it. That's the point. Okay, and that's the thing that is, because with this kind of stuff, people are voting with their feet, and the mainstream politicians are not sufficiently clued up on this yet to actually try to bring this into normal legislative process. That's a big problem too.
Bruno Latour suggests a return to John Dewey's notion of ad hoc publics.
You could have a discussion about that. That's well, God bless him. I don't think it's. I don't think, again, there's a sense in which, yes, return, but how do you do it, right? The question is, what does the reinvention mean in the current climate? It's one thing to invoke all these wonderful names, right? Usually at least 100 years old. And but if we really do take seriously how radically technology is transforming our life world, then the reinvention is going to be pretty much an invention, even if you do start quoting John Dewey till the cows come home. Really, and all these people who talk about Habermas all the time, same thing with them.
No, that's more about consensus. For Latour, it's dissensus.
No, but the point is that the forums, you got to think about what Dewey had in mind as a forum in which one could do this kind of thing is not the kind of world we're talking about. And this is where, as it were, the material conditions for institution building need to be taken quite seriously in this kind of project.
Then it might come back to care, no?
Yeah, sure. But care, care.
So you've just trapped yourself in a Stieglerian position there.
What's care? I mean, no, because...
Well, I can tell you what it is for me.
No, but look, here's where I would say something very good about social democracy. There's a sense in which social democracy managed to scale up the idea of care, okay, which is very important, because care is often regarded as a very kind of personal thing, a kind of spontaneous thing between people interacting with each other and so forth. But one of the things, at least for a while in the second half of the 20th century that we did have, I think it's disappearing now, but we did have, was this kind of sense of collective care, right? Which was being reinforced by government in various kinds of ways and was part of the way people thought about their relationship to the societies they were in, okay? And so we did have a scaled up notion of care. So it's not like it's inconceivable. But I don't think we live in this world anymore. I think the justifications for care now are being scaled back to levels of interaction which are spontaneous. And when you start to see these notions of care as being based on our dependency as animals, I watch out for that. Because when they say the codependency of animals, again, they mean animals inhabiting a common physical environment. Right? The animals that care for each other are the ones that they live with on a regular basis every day. They're not talking about great big societies of animals that are spread throughout the world that you should have care for, including the ones who are impoverished in Africa. They're not talking about that. That's not what the evolutionists are talking about, right? That is a product of social democracy, to have this sense of having care for people in other countries and all the rest of it. But that's disappearing. This is the problem. That's disappearing, and it's not clear how we're going to maintain or reinvent it.
There's a question about substitution, isn't there? And that's one that goes all the way through Stiegler's work, where he says that you start off with societies that are based on mimicry, that are based on mimesis, and then you get societies whose symbolic relationships are based on writing and the text, and then you get societies that are based on, you know, the original analog technologies, and then you get digitization. And all the way through that history, what you have is the evolution of certain symbolic relationships which articulate ideal objects that we have a certain measure of commitment to. So I guess a question that I would be very interested in hearing your answer to was, what would be the nature of that process of substitution as it goes forward?
Well, I would say the first thing, I mean, I'm just going to make a very basic point, is that the competences that are needed, we're going to need multiple competences in the world that we live in now. Because I do think we actually are going to need people who are technologically very competent in terms of establishing networks and maintaining them and so forth, in the kind of way that Silicon Valley talks about. But they also have to have some of this kind of what you might call cultural depth, the kind of thing that Stiegler's trying to preserve. Because they don't have that, right? However much goodwill they may have, and I'm willing to grant the goodwill of most of these people. They really do want to save the world, these guys in Silicon Valley. They just don't have a sense of what the world is that they're trying to save. That's the only problem.
That's very true.
Right. I mean, and so the thing is that there's going to be a need for a kind of hybridization of competences here to do this. Because I do think, I don't think that just a lot of more exhortative political talk is going to actually get us there. We're going to need some people who can actually, as it were, I hate to say it, form a new technocracy, because that's the thing that Hillary Clinton just got defeated on. But in a sense, this is kind of where we need to go. We need to kind of reinvent a lot of Hillary Clinton's talk in this kind of new, more advanced form. That would be what I would say, just as a first pass to answer your question.
Any other questions from the floor? Do you guys have any more points for each other?
No, I think we're okay.
I think we're
okay. We're cool.
I'd just like to thank our two speakers for a great talk.
Thank you.